Hello everyone and welcome to Chapter 4 on Sexual Health for Women. This chapter is very interesting. It is a setup for next week's chapter, which talks about family planning, birth control options, etc. So make sure that you really look at this chapter in depthly because you will certainly refer back to it next week in Chapter 5. Okay, so let's get started. I'm just going to go over some key aspects of the text. You should have already read the text, and that's why I do the lecture a couple of days after I post the module, to make sure that you've already read the chapter, and that way you won't be kind of lost when you go over the mini lecture. So let's start with perspectives on sexual health and sexuality. And these have changed over the decades, over the centuries. Beforehand, women were getting married very early, and so their sexuality was being explored at an earlier stage. And now women are getting married later in life, or they're choosing not to be married. And those perspectives, particularly in the United States, can sometimes be very liberal, and they change consistently. So cultural and religious dimensions. This is one of those areas where if you identify as Christian or Muslim and other religions that also hold certain viewpoints on women being virgins when they marry, because sexual activity is considered something that is ingrained and only for marriage. And so Christianity viewpoints and also some Islamic viewpoints note that they want the woman to actually be a virgin. Now we know that nowadays it's kind of unrealistic because women are exploring their sexuality as much as men. So these cultural and religious dimensions are in some forms outdated, but they are still practiced by some people in the United States and overseas. So when we look at marriage, it really is something that's universal within every culture, and there's supposed to be benefits that are associated with marriage. And that is where sexual purity kind of comes into play within these different religions and geographical locations. And as we look at sexual behavior, it is consistently changing by cultural values. Now, especially in California and the United States, it's considered free expression. We are able to kind of do what we want with our own bodies without fear of social restraint. And these things can be liberating for some and viewed as too liberal for others. So it depends on where you fall on the conservative, moderate, or liberal stand. Therefore, these behaviors kind of change within different geographics, and even sometimes in the same geographic subsidiaries in the same state or city, you can have different cultural or religious values as well. Let's go ahead and skip over to some additional perspectives. One of them, and this is kind of outdated, is a dowry. And that is when a woman was married, they had money that would be then given to the husband or the husband's family as something that was of value that the bride could bring into the relationship. With that as well, the value of a bride was often intermingled with her virginity, her being a pure individual, where women were not supposed to have intercourse prior to marriage, and men, they weren't necessarily held to that same standard. So in some countries, what they would do to test this value of a bride is on the wedding day, the consummation of the marriage would occur in the bedroom, and if there was blood on the white sheets, then that was supposed to be a sign of the purity and the value of the bride. Now, unfortunately, we know that double standards exist, and there is actually a surgery that some surgeons do, which is a reconstruction of the hymen. And in that case, it allows women to practice or demonstrate their own sexuality and then repair the hymen when they go in to become married, so that they are now technically a virgin. So once the hymen has kind of been disrupted, then that is a sign that you are now not a virgin anymore. So because they want to still have that connection with the marriage and with the value of their brides, women are actually reconstructing the hymen in some cases to still contain that bride value and their virginity. And then we come on to some additional aspects such as sexual aggression and commercial sex in the commercial sex industry. I live in Chatsworth, and Chatsworth is one of the hubs of pornography in California. Now, I didn't know that when I moved here, and I have been very fortunate to not have experienced any of that, but being in Southern California, you can kind of expect that as a more liberal state, there is more activity within the sex industry, commercializing it and showing sexuality for women. So this is actually a great state to be in if you have more liberal viewpoints on how you want to express your sexuality as a woman. And then, of course, there are legal dimensions. Up until fairly recently, same-sex couples could not actually become legally married. And that's something that was taken all the way to the Supreme Court. And now we do recognize same-sex marriages and partnerships. The same thing when it came to child support and divorces and marriage. These things were aspects that hadn't really been introduced in large areas to society. And as a result, it did affect men and women separately. But now women were starting to see in same-sex relationships, I have to pay child support. And before, when we look at child support, it's almost always the male pays to the female for the care of the child. But equal laws, equal opportunity. When a same-sex couple also divorces, then those standards still apply. And so sometimes we don't think about these things when we are engaged in our own sexual expressions, but they do have repercussions, and they do have very, very important meanings to same-sex couples as well. So some women found themselves paying alimony and child support for their relationships, and I don't think that they were quite prepared to do that. Alrighty, some more perspectives on sexual health and sexuality. This one is a hot topic. I used to teach in Alabama in the Deep South, and sex education in schools is almost taboo during that Bible Beltway type of location, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi. They really preach abstinence. And research has shown that abstinence-only education, or education just saying don't do it, does not decrease teenage pregnancies or STDs. So simply telling someone not to do it is not enough. We found through research that the more educated men and women are on the female body, on the times where you are the most fertile, how long sperm can live in the vaginal tract, especially with women, we should understand these aspects about our bodies. But as we become more educated about our own sexuality, we can make better decisions when it comes to family planning as well. And so sex education in schools is pretty critical. I think all of us have been to the point where we had to watch the videos in school and our parents had to sign waivers, and some people's parents opted to not have them do that. But sex education is very, very critical because we don't want our children, or we don't want ourselves, to learn about sex outside of the classroom as a first-time experience. So we really should be educated on everything. We can take a careful approach to it, but education is education. And now, since we're not in the traditional classroom, we can't really do the classroom discussion, but you can integrate some of this information into your discussion board. So what we have here are what are some current national or international news items related to commercial sex, prostitution, same-sex marriages, sex education in schools. And just one of them can relate to women as it pertains to athletics. And there were some cases a few years ago about a specific woman running in the 800 meter and mile races. And she ended up having secondary sex characteristics of men as well, heightened testosterone levels. So those are some of the discussions that we have related to sex and gender identity, and how do these people integrate into society? How do we treat them? These things are very important. So this was more of a sports education type of topic, but it does also play into the curriculum of the schools, because we see that many teenagers and many girls are starting to have sex at younger ages. So if they're starting previous to them turning 18 and leaving and getting in monogamous relationships, they should be knowledgeable about their bodies before they actually get into the real world. So these are some of the percentages with sexual behavior among youth in the United States. And we see that, look at these percentages of high school students that have ever had sexual intercourse. That's almost half. And these data are about 3 years old. So we kind of collect data between 3 and 5 years. So it may have risen, it may have gone down a little bit, but we're looking around about the 50th percentile that are currently sexually active. Look at this number. We're almost around 40%. That's a huge percentage of people, a huge percentage of high school students, 4 out of 10, who are sexually active and who have had sexual intercourse before age 13. So that's only about 7%, but still 13 is very, very young. It's just about the starting age for puberty, and women and men don't truly always understand their bodies at that young of an age because we just haven't obtained the wisdom yet. And so 13 is very, very young to have beginning intercourse. When I used to teach in the K through 12 system, I was at a middle school and there was actually a 7th grader who was pregnant at the time. And so when we look at, kids that young are not engaged in sexual behavior, yes, they are. And for women particularly, women have to carry more of the responsibility, in my opinion, because women are the ones who carry children. So you will actually, and I use this word very loosely, you will actually be stuck if you decide to continue on with that pregnancy and the man decides to leave. You are kind of stuck taking care of that child by yourself, especially if you don't have any other family members. So when you are not carrying the child, then the decisions to stay or leave, you have that decision. When you are a woman, you don't really have that decision whether you want to leave if you are carrying the baby. So that's why I think women should have to be a little bit more careful in educating themselves about their bodies so that they can make informed decisions and they can make the choices that are the best for them, not for the other person. Let's move on a little bit and talk about gender identity. So sex, we know, is biologically what you came out as. XX, woman. XY chromosome, male. And so those stay the same regardless of how you identify as a person. The identity, sometimes we know, doesn't necessarily match the sex, the biological sex that you are at birth. So gender identity and sex are two different things. Sex is XY, XX chromosome. There are some examples, there are some anomalies that have XXY chromosomes, etc. But for the most part, the vast majority of people are going to fall into the XX woman, XY male chromosome. And whether or not they identify as that is something totally different. And that will bring us into, let me skip over here actually, transgender, gender dysphoria, and transitioning. So some people who don't identify with the sex that they were born may transition into the identity that they feel they most belong to. And these types of connotations we have trouble in society with how to adapt to them, with how to react to them. And especially when it comes to women transitioning as men, one of the things that we have to be very careful about is understanding that our bodies still produce female hormones. And so transitioning, that doesn't always mean a medical transition. You can just simply choose to live your life as a man versus a woman. But when you go through medical transitioning, your body will produce certain chemicals, certain hormones, just because of that XX chromosome detail that you are born with. And in order to transition, you would have to take supplements or shots to suppress the production of certain hormones and then to increase the production of other hormones. For example, women have testosterone. We just don't have as much testosterone as men, and vice versa. So you would take supplements or shots in order to increase the levels of testosterone in the body. And that way you could help identify as the gender in which you feel the most excited to, or what should I say, it's a bad choice of words there, that you feel most, that you could adhere to most. And then a couple of things that I want you to also consider putting into your discussion board are some of the challenges faced by transgender individuals. One of those was the bathroom issue, particularly when it came to young children who were transitioning or who identified as something else. What bathroom are they going to use? And now we see bathrooms are unisex bathrooms. And some people still want to be able to use the bathroom that they identify with, and they know that at home we don't have these issues. But home is a safe environment, and out in public is not necessarily the same environment as at home because people have different viewpoints and they will react differently. So in public now we're starting to see unisex bathrooms, and that can pose some additional violence problems for women because women tend to be attacked more so when they are transitioning. Remember that even if you identify as something else, your muscle mass is still going to be lower than a man's. So we have some additional threats of violence when it comes to identifying in restrooms and things like that.